Hi, and welcome to Sunday Journal. I'm Grady Collane in the CapeCod.com News Center, joined today by a special guest from Mass Audubon. Can you introduce yourself for our listeners?
Yes, my name is Karen Dourdeville, and I'm the Sea Turtle Research Coordinator at Mass Audubon, Wellfleet Bay.
All right, awesome. And thank you again for taking some time out of your busy schedule to have this conversation with me.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Glad to do it. I love to talk about sea turtles.
all right, awesome. Well, we have excellent news. That is the main topic of today's segment. We wanted to talk more about sea turtle stranding season for the Cape and Islands region as the waters get a bit colder. Talk a little bit more about what that is for people who might not be familiar, as well as more about some of the initiatives and programs going on at Mass Audubon. Do you mind just elaborating more for those who might not be familiar with the cold, stunning sea turtle stranding season is?
Yes, well, our sea turtle work at Mass Audubon is really year-round now, and I can talk about some other aspects of it besides the cold stun season. Of course, Mass Audubon has many different aspects. It's a statewide organization, and advocacy and education, conservation, land protection, but at Wellfleet Bay, we work with different species, birds, of course, horseshoe crabs, diamondback terrapins, which are another, not a sea turtle, but another turtle. So our work is broad-ranging, but I just work with sea turtles. And right now, really primarily November, December into early January, is what we call our cold-stunned sea turtle season. And just to back up a little bit, there are 4 species of sea turtles that feed in our waters, our meaning Massachusetts waters, really in the late spring, summer, and well into the fall. Those are the giant leatherback sea turtles, which don't cold stun, and then the other 3 species which do cold stun, and those are Kemp's Ridleys, and they're juveniles, roughly dinner plate size, give or take. They're the most endangered sea turtle in the world. And loggerhead sea turtles, which are technically listed as threatened under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, and then juvenile green sea turtles, which also are listed as threatened. The leatherback and the Kemp's Ridley are listed as endangered. So those, those 4 of the only 7 species of sea turtles in the world, those 4 feed in our waters. And as I said, those last 3 have been feeding all summer, many north of Cape Cod, so up into the Gulf of Maine. We don't know how many, but at least some of them, when they begin to head south for the winter, the water begins cooling, the day length light is getting shorter. They're heading south. It's too cold for them to spend the winter up here. And at least some of those 3 species get basically stuck in Cape Cod Bay by the physical hook of Cape Cod. You know, when you think of the map of the Cape, it's like a big hook. And they get down into Cape Cod Bay, into sometimes warm pockets of water. But then as the water continues to cool, these are cold-blooded reptiles, and they become slower. Their metabolism slows down. They swim more slowly. They're not feeding as much, and that just gradually progresses until they really aren't swimming or feeding at all. And they're floating at the surface in order to breathe. They have to breathe air. And that's when, if we get the right winds, and it really depends on winds, so winds blowing onto shore, onto those Cape Cod Bay beaches, these cold-stunned sea turtles begin washing onto those Cape Cod Bay beaches. And that's where our whole program comes into play with we've got over 200 trained volunteers that staff assign to specific beaches depending on wind direction, really. And they go out and patrol these beaches day and night because it's predominantly at or just after high tide that the turtles are washing in. That's not always true, but the majority of them of the strandings occur at or just after high tide. So at specific times, we send volunteers to specific beaches based on that wind direction, and they look for turtles and begin finding them. And they are trained to know what to do. These turtles at this point are very sick. They've been not eating for a long time. They're dehydrated. Their stress hormone levels are very high. Most of them have some degree of pneumonia. So the important thing is to get the turtles off the beach, but in the proper way. The volunteers, when they find a turtle, they call us. They call our 24/7 manned hotline, and they know to bring the turtle above the high tide line on the beach. They're not going in the water for the turtle, but they pull it up, they lift it if it's small enough up above the high tide line, cover it very carefully with dry seaweed and rack if possible, and then it becomes very situational. When they call, the staff may ask them if they can bring that turtle back to the nearby parking lot where staff will pick it up, or they may just leave it where it is, covered, and then they mark the spot really big, like draw giant arrows in the sand, or so that staff, as they're out there, can easily find them and retrieve them. And then they're transported to Wellfleet Bay Wildlife Sanctuary in temperature-controlled vehicles, so not above 55 degrees. If the turtles are warm too fast, they die. So basically heat off in the cars getting them to the sanctuary. And then at the sanctuary, the staff is prepared to begin quickly processing those turtles. So that's weighing, measuring, scanning for tags, checking for wounds or any other physical anomalies, taking photographs, and temperature stabilizing. We have special room that is 55 degrees, and they're kept in there until a transport, and we have generally 2 per day, and these are with trained volunteers also. They volunteer their time and car and gas to transport these turtles to one of 2 rehab facilities. Most of them go to New England Aquarium's Animal Care Center in Quincy, and a smaller number go to the National Marine Life Center in Buzzards Bay, where they begin rehabilitation. So that's, in a nutshell, that's the process.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a very involved, very methodical process. I do have a few questions. You raised up a few things that I wanted to elaborate further on. First of all is you mentioned that of the 4 sea turtles that are in this local area, leatherbacks don't really cold stun. Can you elaborate more on why that is?
Yes, leatherbacks are huge. They're the giant certainly of the sea turtle world and arguably of the reptilian world. They're 6-8 feet long, can weigh 1,000 pounds. So many people are just awestruck when they realize these are in our waters. But they, besides size alone, they have some physical adaptations where they can swim and survive and thrive in much colder water than the so-called hard-shell species. And so these leatherbacks, in fact, a lot of them are feeding off eastern Canada in the summer, or much colder water. And they get south. They get around the Cape and head. They also can't stay up here all winter, but they just get out of Cape Cod Bay if they're in there to begin with, and don't cold stun.
That is very interesting. So I imagine that for the November stranding season, for them, this is balmy weather, really.
It's been very warm, and the bigger factor truly is the water temperature. It's still 49 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's from a NOAA buoy that's out in kind of up in central Cape Cod Bay that we monitor closely. You know, there are exceptions to that. On these cold nights, as water comes in over our giant tidal flats, you know, Brewster, Eastham, tidal flats, that water can become much colder temporarily. So any turtles in that water are going to be a lot colder. But then as that tide flows out, it mixes. But so that water is more dictated by air temp, as is water in Wellfleet Harbor also can get very cold. Again, shallow in there. But the general bay is still 49 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's warm for December. So we know there's still a lot of cold stuns out there. We have no idea how many, but we know they're still out there and still coming in, but now we just need the winds to bring them in. And we've really only had one significant wind event, we call it, where it blows in one onshore direction for at least 3 high tides. And that was last week. And on that day, we had 87 turtles wash in. But that's by far the biggest day this year so far.
Oh, wow, it's a lot. So actually, we know that the New England Aquarium recently reported that it is treating over 200 sea turtles suffering from hypothermic conditions at its sea turtle hospital. So almost half of them came in just on that one night?
Well, it was over one day, so 2 high tides. You know, the high tide moves back not quite an hour each day, like the AM high tide and the PM high tide. So a lot of the high tides are dark this time of year, at least one a day, often 2 a day. If you've got a 5 a.m. and a 5 p.m. high tide, they're both dark. So walkers are out there in the dark doing this patrolling. And we can have one at 2 in the morning, and walkers are out there.
Well, yeah, definitely a big thank you to them for their important work that they're doing. That also, I guess, can be a little dangerous walking around on the beaches that late at night, especially in the colder weather.
Well, we certainly require that. Our main, we really have 3 tenets of our sort of mission. One is human safety is foremost, and then to try to rescue as many live turtles as possible, but then retrieve as many deceased cold stuns as all of them, but as many as possible for research. So human safety factors large, and we require that any volunteer, well, first of all, they have to be trained, they have to attend our trainings, and they have to know. A lot of people know just one beach really, really well. And you don't have to walk in the dark. I mean, we do have volunteers who only do daylight walks, and that's fine. But to be a night walker or a dark walker, they really have to practice on that beach every year because, as I'm sure you know, beaches change with erosion due to storms and rising sea level. And so they really have to get out before the season and get to know that beach. So we don't just assign walkers randomly to different beaches. They sign up for a particular beach or a small range of beaches that they know. And in the dark, at night, we require that we prefer they walk with a buddy. If they do walk alone, they need to set up with someone they trust to let them know when they're leaving, when they're expected back, and they need to check in with that person when they're back. And if that person's worried about them, they contact us right away. So we have a safety protocol for the dark walks.
All right, awesome. Safety first. That is excellent. You mentioned as well the research opportunities, and I guess we're about to get a little grim, but this episode is focused on the science, so we wanted to warn the squeamish
Yeah.
first. But what is some of the research opportunity that presents itself from one of the from the deceased turtles that you're bringing in? I assume or necropsies, and then
hmm
also from just the even the live stranded ones as well. What's some of the opportunity there for information and data?
Well, that's a really, really good question. And I did want to talk about the science that we both facilitate and do from the deceased one. So it's about a 75% live admittance to rehab rate. In other words, about three-quarters of the cold stuns are alive, and we transport them to rehab. And the rehab facilities are fabulous with their expert veterinary and rescue care, and most of those turtles survive, and eventually they may go to other rehab facilities to continue rehab, but they eventually are returned to the ocean, which is the ultimate goal. But the 25% or so that wash in deceased, and especially that number increases as the water's colder and the season goes on, we freeze those carcasses. And we are very grateful to Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution for letting us keep our carcasses in their freezer. And then in the spring, we conduct necropsies or animal autopsies on those carcasses at Woods Hole at their wonderful necropsy facility. And it's our own staff, Wellfleet, Mass Audubon Wellfleet Bay staff, but then we invite the whole Woods Hole Oceanographic biology department, anybody who wants to take part. We have graduate students. We have visitors from NOAA and Mass Wildlife. But then we have, really importantly, a team of research colleagues from other institutions who, many of which have done this now for years. They come to our necropsies. They take samples, tissue samples from these dead sea turtles that they use in ongoing and new research projects, sea turtle conservation research projects, which are many of which are really cutting edge sea turtle science work. So it's really that's where the science comes in, really for us, is really through these necropsies, and it's very gratifying because we want to see these sea turtles that don't make it put to as much use in helping conserve the species as possible. And this is how we do it.
Do you mind talking a little bit more about some of the data you might be looking at when it comes to these necropsies? Like, is it diet or like studying how they move in the water? Like, what's some of the information?
Well, there's one ongoing study which is just sort of coming to a more final stage right now as stable isotope analysis, if you're familiar with that term at all. It's really the atomic makeup of tissue, in this case, sea turtle tissue. And by looking at that atomic and molecular makeup of tissues, scientists are able to at least get some knowledge about where that sea turtle was feeding, because there are really fingerprints for different parts of the ocean known that cause the deposition of stable isotopes in tissues. And so that's one. So it's where they may have been feeding before they ended up, down in Cape Cod Bay. Another one is looking at the microbiome makeup. You hear a lot about that these days in people, but it's basically the microbes in the gut of sea turtles. And so one study is looking at that. We've had studies looking at parasites in these sea turtles. Another really interesting one, which again is evolving, is working on methods to age these young turtles. You can't. I mean, you get a feeling for how old they are based on size, but it varies a lot. And so there's a researcher in the Southeast who works with one of the researchers at NOAA in Woods Hole, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, in looking at the humerus bone, so the upper arm, or in their case, flipper bone, from these carcasses, from these dead sea turtles. And they section them, they slice them and dye them, and they actually have rings of bone deposited, sort of like tree rings, and they can age them. So using the size data, they're able to age the sea turtles. And that's now morphing into a way to do this without working with a dead turtle. They're doing it just through some scanning of live turtles. So that's exciting. That's still kind of in process. And then there was a new study we started last spring on PFAS, the forever chemicals in sea turtle tissue, and a genetic look at some of our juvenile greens, where they fit in with some of the nesting green populations farther south. So that's an example of some of the studies.
A small sampling, and as well the aging as well. That's a very interesting thing. I was going to make an observation of it's a shame it's simply not as easy as like being able to count the rings on a tree, but in actuality, it turns out that's almost exactly the way it's going.
Yeah.
Very interesting as well. And we have the other 75% of the population, which is hopefully successfully getting sent back to the ocean. I know a lot of them can be tagged. So do you mind talking a little bit more about some of the ways that the live turtles can go on to help out research opportunities as well?
Well, certainly the veterinary staff at like New England Aquarium especially have developed many of the protocols for treating these cold stuns as well as just sea turtles in general by working with these cold stuns through the years. That's evolved and improved over the years, and they really have sort of written the book and written papers about it, certainly, of how to treat these animals, how to transport them to other rehab facilities within the best health as possible. And when these sea turtles, these rehabilitated cold stuns are released, they all receive a PIT tag. That's the passive integrated transponder tag. So that's the same kind of tag that a veterinarian might put in your cat or dog. They all get those. And so no matter where they're released, whether it's down south or farther north, they all get those, which are tiny. It's like grain of rice size. The only time that would be of use is if that turtle restranded. And we get every year, well, I'd say 0 to 3 repeat cold stun stranders. And there's already been one this year.
Some problem children, I see.
Well, yeah, but it's a really small number, which is great. And the good thing, really, about it'd be bad if it were a higher number, because we'd worry that, too many were just coming north again. But it doesn't seem to be the case. But these few that do, it just is important for documenting their survival, that the rehab works and they survive and thrive. And there was already one this year that was pit tagged. And many of them get these metal flipper tags. But then a few get much more sophisticated satellite tags, and they can be tracked. And that gives lots of data, but it's expensive, and a lot of these cold stuns are too small to put a satellite tag on. There's a real, very strict drag coefficient that's permitted, so you can't just put a satellite tag on any sea turtle.
Sure, just slapping like a car battery.
And it is expensive. It is expensive.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
research institutions can't tag as many as they might like to.
We're about coming up on time, but I did want to ask as well a little bit more about the very nature of this happening. It's the hook shape of Cape Cod. We also know that from the International Fund for Animal Welfare, they recently said that this is one of the number one places, unfortunately, for stranding dolphins.
Right, right.
Is it just a nature of? I mean, you've already mentioned it is the nature of the hook shape of Cape Cod, but is there anywhere else that this happens that you know of in the world, or is this just a freak geological phenomenon unique to this one part of the Earth, as far as you're aware?
Well, there are other cold stun events that happen, such as in the Gulf of Mexico, but they're different. I mean, they can involve thousands of sea turtles. That's due to a sudden cold snap in very near shore waters. Like I think it was 3 years ago in Texas, there was that huge freeze, if you remember, that lasted like 10 days in Texas. And there were thousands of mostly green sea turtles that cold stunned, washed in. For the most part, though, those are very quick events. The turtles really don't undergo rehab. They're just kept in a warmer spot for a few days, and then the air temp quickly warms back up, and they're released. So that's different than what we do. This is the largest annual event of this kind of um, time span of cold stunning turtles that we know of in the world. And it's unique in that there's so many, about 85 to 90% of them are these juvenile Kemp's Ridleys. And those are the most endangered sea turtle in the world. So it's unique in that regards too. I mean, they do cold stun in the Gulf of Mexico, but not in the numbers that we get. But I would love, in the last minute, if I could, to just touch. I mentioned our year-round work. We also, we have these sea turtles feeding in the summer. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have these four species that come up here to feed. These are nutrient-rich waters. So this is the chow line for sea turtles or part of the chow line for sea turtles in the Northwest Atlantic. And so these four species are feeding, but there are also a lot of boaters out there in our waters. And so in the summer, we operate a hotline and website aimed at boaters, asking them to report sightings of sea turtles. And we vet these sightings carefully for species accuracy. We also often get photos from the boaters. So we're gaining these data points of where and when sea turtles are occurring in our waters. But now it's important to remember these are just opportunistic, meaning they're not systematically collected. They're not like they're skewed to where boaters are. But we've done this now since 2002. And so it's a really big database, and it's really useful for showing trends of occurrence and changing trends. And there have been some changes. But also, secondly, besides getting these data points, we are trying to teach boaters that sea turtles are here. And if you hit one with your boat, you probably will kill it. And so to watch ahead of your boat, so you don't hit and kill a sea turtle, but also you're going to have a more interesting trip if you watch and see things such as sea turtles in the water. So that website is seaturtlesightings.org. And as I said, Mass Audubon has operated that since 2002. So and then in the summer, we also respond to strandings, but these are very different than the cold stuns. These are these feeding turtles, healthy, happy, eating away, packing on fat in the summer. But if they get hit by a boat or entangled, hit by a boat, those strikes are usually fatal. Entanglement in fixed vertical line gear, just like with right whales, that's usually the leatherbacks, and the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown are the disentanglers of not only whales but sea turtles. So if they can get to that leatherback that's entangled in time, they're expert disentanglers, and they can release that turtle with at least some degree of success, depending on the wounds that the turtle might have from the entanglement. But some of these, especially the vessel-struck ones, wash onto beaches. So we respond to all of those in southeastern Mass and document the stranding and take tissue samples, measure, photograph, and then depending on where it is, we may do a full beach necropsy. We can't always do that, but so response to summer strandings is a big part of what we do through the summer and early fall.
By summer necropsy, do you mean like you just section off a portion of the beach and do it right there on site with some scientists, or do you mean something different?
Well, we do it ourselves. And yes, we can do it on the beach if it's not a private beach, in front of somebody's house. It's very situational. Sometimes if it's on a public beach, we can work with the town to come and actually, like, say, a leatherback, move that turtle to, say, a landfill or wherever they might take roadkill deer, and then we can do a necropsy there on it. So each case is somewhat different, and sometimes we just have to take our data, not do a necropsy if it's most of the summer strandings are loggerheads and leatherbacks, and the loggerheads are smaller. So a lot of times we take all of our data and then bury it on site.
Very interesting.
Leatherbacks, we pretty much have to leave where they are just because they're so big and heavy.
Right, yeah, you mentioned earlier 1,000 pounds of animal to move.
Yes.
Can't really imagine that being an easy task. But that is really interesting. The unfortunate, the reality of what happens in a local marine ecosystem, and it is not always just pristine beaches as far as the eye can see. It is a part of the natural cycle. So it's very interesting to know that that's sort of the unseen job that goes on with you guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there anything else you wanted to highlight for our listeners while I still have you about some of the other projects that you have going on, other initiatives or ways people can help out Mass Audubon if they're interested in learning more or helping out?
Well, we always appreciate, of course, help with funding of our programs. We're a nonprofit. As far as the cold stun, since this is the season, a lot of our cold stuns are actually found by just the general public walking a beach. These are public beaches, and lots of people get out on them. And so we do post signs on the Cape Cod Bay beaches of what to do if you find a turtle. But I could stress here, do not put it back in the water. It will die. It cannot live in the water at this point if it's cold stunned on the beach. And to call Wellfleet Bay Wildlife Sanctuary. And on every public beach in Cape Cod Bay is a sign with our number, but you could also Google it and get the number and call it. And if it's during office hours, you'll get a person answer right away. If it's after hours, you'll get a prompt to just telling you how to get to our hotline person, and you'll get a person right away, 24 hours a day. So move that turtle carefully above the high tide line, cover it with dry rack, never with sand, but just with dry seaweed, and call our number. And then you will get instructions. But please do not put it back in the water. Do not put it in a warm car thinking I'm helping this turtle, I'm going to warm it up. You will kill it.
Quick last question. The covering them with the seagrass or some seaweed as well, is that something that is to help try and keep them warm, or is that to disguise them from predators while you're waiting for someone to come rescue them?
Well, very good on your part, both. It's to keep the wind off of them, because when they're washing in, it's generally windy. So the dry seaweed blocks the wind, but it also keeps predators away, especially from the head and eye area.
All right, awesome, Karen. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Well, we appreciate your helping get word out about sea turtles and our work with them. And I think everybody loves sea turtles and wants to help them.
I'm Gordy Gillane in the CapeCod.com News Center, and thank you for listening to Sunday Journal.